So our special guest today is Professor Abhijit Gupta. Good evening, Professor Gupta. And a very good evening to everyone attending this discussion from different parts of the world. I will now introduce Professor Gupta, who is Professor of English at Jadavpur University and Director of Jadavpur University Press and the School of Cultural Texts and Records. He was co-editor with Shobhan Chakraborty of the Book History in India series, of which 4 volumes have been published. They are Print Areas 2004, Movable Tide 2008, New Word Order 2011, and Founts of Knowledge 2015. A 5th volume is under preparation. He was associate editor for South Asia for the Oxford Companion to the Book 2010. His bibliography and location register of all books printed in Bengali from 1801 to 1914 is now the basis of the 2 centuries of Indian print project at the British Library, London. His latest book, The Spread of Print in Colonial India into the Hinterland, 2021, was recently published by Cambridge University Press. It's such a pleasure to finally have you here on the screen, Professor Gupta, to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the publication of Ulysses. And Professor Gupta has very kindly agreed to speak on the uniqueness and legacy of James Joyce's phenomenal Ulysses. Also, the participants, if you have any questions, please write them down in the chat box. They will be taken up towards the end of the session. So, Professor Gupta, it belongs to you now.
Thank you, Abhijit. Thank you very much for that generous introduction and for inviting me to talk about James Joyce in general and Ulysses in particular. I must warn everyone at the very beginning that we might occasionally be interrupted by dogs barking in the background. These are two of the dogs who have free access into our flat and who have just finished dinner and come into the house, and they might want to participate from time to time, but I will try and keep it down to a minimum. And I'm immediately thinking of the way in which, for example, I suppose the unnamed cat in the Bloom household appears in the very first section and is mewing loudly for milk in a sort of jumble of consonants, which I always take great pleasure in reading out in class. Is it going to be meow or meow, or what kind of feline call will it be? But anyway, to talk about Joyce, I'm not an expert on Joyce. I'm primarily by training a Victorianist, and it is only by accident that I found myself teaching Joyce's Ulysses in the department where I work, which is the English department at Jadavpur University. For the last few years, I've been coordinating a course called Idea of the Modern, where we look at various aspects of modernity and, of course, modernism. And in that, we have rather ambitiously and I suppose rashly, we have Ulysses as one of the essential readings. We never finish the novel in class. I mean, it's not possible to quote unquote finish Ulysses in class, but we do get started with great vim and vigor, and then we sort of somehow, I think we stop somewhere around Aeolus. Just after that semester runs out, and then we sort of quickly leapfrog to Ithaca and Penelope, and by the time the classes dwindle to maybe 10 or 12 students. But actually, this is just about departmental lore, as it were. Over the last 10 or 12 years, I was very gratified to find that a number of our students began to work on take an interest in Joyce studies. Many of them, in fact, traveled almost ritually to the Joyce summer schools in Trieste and Dublin. And 2 very important doctoral dissertations were produced not in Jadavpur, but by students from Jadavpur who, so Dipanjan Moitra working on genetic criticism, and Shulamna Chattopadhyay working on, and also working on Joyce in Notre Dame. And these have been 2 very substantial contributions to Joycean scholarship in recent times. And I also expect that certain students from over the recent past will also perhaps go on to work on Joyce. I should also here, wearing my hat as a publisher, because I and look after the Jadavpur University Press, I should also let you know that we are publishing the first ever Bengali translation of, I suppose, first ever translation of Joyce's Dubliners into Bengali on Bloomsday 2023. It is a translation being done by several hands. And in fact, this project was mooted during last year's Bloomsday, and we hope to publish Dubliners in Bengali in 2023. Ulysses, as far as I know, no one has essayed it in Bengali. I believe there's a Malayalam translation which exists, but no other South Asian language, to my knowledge, has. And it is, in a sense, curious. I'm sorry, I'm sort of starting in a rambling way, but in Bengal's its interaction with European modernity was primarily through the lens of first Baudelaire, then Eliot and Ezra Pound, and this was part of the essential part of the curriculum of any Bengali modernist of the 1930s and 40s. And all these poets were translated many times into Bengali. So Baudelaire, of course, has been translated ad infinitum from the original French into Bengali. Eliot was translated several times, notably by the modernist poet Vishnu De, and also sporadically by Rabindranath Tagore. Pound probably was not. I mean, it's difficult to translate Pound. How do you translate Pound? How do you translate his cantos? But he was an influence, as he was everywhere else. I mean, if you think of the Pound era, it's sort of filaments, to use a kind of Woolfian term, touched even Calcutta's modernism. And that's a different story. But strangely enough, Bengali modernity did not engage with Joyce to that extent. And one of the things we are trying to also address in the introduction to our to the Dubliners volume that we are doing is why this might have been so. Why has, I mean, there is no dearth of I mean, if you think it's copyright that was standing in its way, no, there's no dearth of unauthorized translations of in general translation culture of both in Bengal and Bangladesh. So the question of, I mean, certain stories from Dubliners, for instance, have been translated and published in little magazines here and there. But the larger question of why there has been a certain hesitation in Bengal's engagement with Joyce studies in Bengali language is something which is a curiosity, I think, and is something which I'm sure other scholars will address. Now, the comments that I make today will I mean, you cannot really condense Joyce and his legacy into an hour-long lecture, so I have to take a very kind of a partial view of the question, as it were, and maybe try and address it from the point of view as a publisher. I mean, I know in a literature classroom, in the way in which you teach Ulysses. I mean, can you really teach Ulysses? Sometimes I feel that it's best just to read it aloud, because it's a work which actually works very well when read aloud. It's among other things also a comic masterpiece. It's great fun to read Ulysses aloud. You have to perform Ulysses in many ways. Silent reading, yes, of course, but that is something which you do sporadically. You probably don't read Ulysses from cover to cover, Finnegan's Wake, even less so. You dip into it from time to time. But in the classroom, its teaching is a kind of a complex question. Now, what do you tell your students? I mean, you're looking at a tradition of novel reading which has moved far away from the late 17th or early 18th century modalities of narrative, where the novel was closely mimicking, you might say, the everyday. I mean, the journalistic or the historical. So if you think of, for example, early Daniel Defoe, in a way, everything is being catalogued in the life of the protagonist, be it Robinson Crusoe or anyone else, or Jonathan Wild for that matter. But there is really no kind of differentiation between what is remarkable and what is not, what is of interest to the reader and what is mundane. Now, I don't need to tell this audience that Henry Fielding opens up this question in Tom Jones and begins to distinguish between and makes a claim, and he has to make these claims separately in a prefatory chapter at the beginning of every book of his novel, that I'm not going to imitate the historian's method. The historian's method is to report equally on every segment of time which is past, but it is the novelist's prerogative to magnify or telescope time, that certain things are considered important or interesting, and or of interest to the reader. And those things will be lingered on and dilated. There may be decades which might pass in a second. So if you remember, the first third of Henry Fielding's Tom Jones takes place over kind of the childhood and, the buildings of Tom Jones. Then the next section, next third, constitutes about 6 days on the road in June 1745 during the Jacobite Rebellion. Then the last third, another month or so. And Fielding has to make a special case for this. He has to make a special case for why he has to do that. And in a sense, much of the Western novel follows Henry Fielding in doing that, till we come to a moment in modernity. Perhaps you might say there are many claimants to who sort of provides this kind of bend. Proust is a claimant, this massive recherche de temps perdu, where it's a project of memory and where time itself becomes relative. I mean, what the passage of time, in reality, the passage of psychological time are two completely different things. And here, and you might say, or you think of a lesser-known novel by the Russian novelist Goncharov, called Oblomov, written in the mid-19th century, about a man who just refuses to get out of bed. Or slightly later, one thinks of Thomas Mann's novel Lotte in Weimar, where there is a central section, about 40 or 50 pages, where it takes place entirely in the head of Goethe. He thinks. Now, how long does that thinking, what is the period of that thought? Is it an instantaneous thought, or does it sort of range over a measurable period of time? Now, all of these preoccupations, I would say, modernist preoccupations, and of course, these preoccupations arise with the novel of interiority. All this is well known. But what Joyce is doing is taking this to a logical extreme, in a sense, and telling us that it's possible to tell a story about a very mundane individual, and to tell the story of his everyday life. The moment he gets up from bed, he eats breakfast, he goes to the toilet, he reads the newspaper, he puts on his outdoor clothes, he goes out, he searches for his key, and this strange line is potato. What does that even mean? There are, of course, mysteries. Goes out, buys meat, pays for the coin, looks at women, walks down the streets, and ad infinitum and ad nauseam, it goes on doing these things. And this is completely the antithesis of the Fielding, of the position of Fielding, where he's actually telling us that it's only the interesting things which are worth talking about in a novel. So what constitutes something which is of interest to the reader? And this problem, I would say, is something which goes back even further. I mean, if you think of theater, that is a problem which has to be solved. I mean, not for the most remarkable example I'm sure there are other examples. Think of Shakespeare's Winter's Tale, where between Act 3 and Act 4, there's a passage of almost 20 years. So much so that Shakespeare has to bring a character called Time on stage. And in the beginning of Act 4, he says that I spread my wings, do not impute a crime that has spread my wings, and let slide. Words to that effect, that 2 decades have passed, and now Perdita has grown up, the child who was exposed to the elements by Antigonus at the end of Act 3. She has grown up, and she will now meet Florizel, who is the prince of Bohemia, daughter of I forget who. So by the time Joyce is writing Ulysses between 1914 and 1921, is completely reversed to this problem on its head. And he's saying, why would a reader be interested in what happens to an individual or several individuals in a closely knit community, some of whom know each other intimately, some of whom don't? And again, this is also not the modernist city par excellence of Baudelaire, for example. Baudelaire, which Baudelaire is regarded as an essential part of any modernist curriculum, and the way in which he looks at the city, in which he establishes the flaneur at the center of his modernist aesthetics. It is the usually male poet questing figure who sort of consumes the city in a certain kind of way. And Walter Benjamin, later writing about Baudelaire, will enlarge on this habit of the flaneur to explore a city in all its multiplicity and all its potentially endless geographical or specialities. So the shortest line between two A and B is not a straight line. It's not a straight route, but in a sort of kind of in multiplicity of routes, you can proceed from A to B in various ways. Now, for Baudelaire, that becomes a kind of a part of your Vedemekam, part of your curriculum, that you have to, as a poet, you have to consume this city in every time in a very different way. You can see that idea being worked on much later by Italo Calvino in his novel Invisible Cities, where Marco Polo is asked by the Kublai Khan. He's bored, and asks him to tell stories about the cities he has visited. And Marco Polo obliges and tells him stories about the city of gold and the city with whatever screaming statues. I'm just making these up. The city with floating bridges. They're all fantastic and they do not exist. And eventually you realize that he's only talking about one city, the only city he knows, and that is Venice. And they're all various ways of talking about the city of Venice. Now, this is a kind of a modernist fantasy, you might say, that the city is realized in new ways, is discovered anew. And for Walter Benjamin, this was more of a spatial rather than temporal exercise. You have to, in a sense, history is banished in that way, from that kind of a view of the city. You're constantly inventing the city, and you're consuming the city in new ways. Now, this becomes eventually a kind of a cliche, though, there are other ways in which the city is consumed. Very recently, and as recently as last week, I spoke about a lesser-known modernist masterpiece, I suppose, for lack of a better word, published just 3 years before Ulysses, and indeed before more Eliot's Wasteland. And it's a long 600-line prose poem. I mean, what do you call it? By Hope Murley, it's called Paris. Now, this was published in an edition of 150 by the Hogarth Press, handset by Virginia Woolf herself, and promptly disappeared from view, and was much later rediscovered by Julia Briggs and, in fact, Neil Gaiman. Now, one of the things what Hope Murley does in Paris is she shows a woman walking around the city of Paris, getting down from the metro, the North-South Metro in Solferino. Goes past Solferino, then she gets off at the Tuileries Garden, and you can see that she's walking into Louvre Museum because the Great War is over. It's 1919. The peace conference is on in Paris, and all the museum has reopened, and all the paintings have sort of resurfaced from the subterranean sleep of 5 years. And she watches them, but it's a very sardonic gaze. She doesn't gush over the usual exhibits, and then she walks out, and she keeps walking through the city of Paris. And Paris becomes a multi-layered text for her. She again consumes the city as a walker, as a flaneuse, you might say, but she also imagines Paris as a multiple historical text. She imagines anachronisms taking place. She looks at the Pont Neuf, one of the many bridges which across the Seine, and she imagines, for instance, Chateaubriand walking and Madame Victor Hugo walking on the same bridge at the same time, not looking at each other. They can't. They're from different centuries. And for her, then Paris becomes almost a kind of a surreal dream experience where she seems to be drowning to her waist in dreams. But eventually, there is a destination. She reaches a hotel where she's been staying with her companion, Jane Ellen Harrison, one of the greatest classicists of her age. So Jane Ellen Harrison would die a year later. She was one of the founder members of Newnham College. She is the same Jane Ellen Harrison described famously by Virginia Woolf in A Room of Her Own, in another walk, when Virginia Woolf is walking along the backs of Cambridge, thinking first about her exclusion from the Trinity College library, and then of the excellent lunch she had had. And then she goes to this new women's college, and she imagines she sees the ghost of Jane Ellen Harrison flash forth in the garden. Of course, she's been dead for a year or two. So there is this strange intersection or triangulation between these three figures: Hope Murley's Jane Ellen Harrison, Virginia Woolf, and typesetting. Now, that kind of a walk, that kind of consumption of a city, Paris, I think is and one of the discussions we were having after that talk was, is it similar to the Joycean method of looking at the city? And I suggested it might be because she was looking at street signage. In that poem by Hope Marlies, you're looking at street signs, you're looking at found objects. It's not a kind of a, the way in which T.S. Eliot's is also, Wasteland is also a bit of a cut and paste in many ways, but this, he cuts and pastes from Tristan and Isolde, the Ring, the Nibelungen, the Upanishads, St. Augustine Confessions. This is a cut paste from bricolier's perspective, street signs, posters, advertisements, and so on and forth. So she's doing something which, again, I think Joyce would have found remarkably interesting. I have no idea whether Joyce knew of or she knew of Joyce. She was right. She disappears after writing in 1919. She writes a couple of novels, one extraordinary fantasy novel called Blood in the Mist, which I think everyone should read, but then she sort of completely goes off the map. Now, sorry, I've been sort of, talking around Joyce, but we're also talking about Joyce because of 1922 and 2022. We are just talking about in a kind of a centenarian way about that, what is largely regarded as annus mirabilis for literature, 1922. Now, and it's an annus mirabilis not just for the usual suspects, which of course we know who they are. We know that it's about Joyce's Ulysses, which comes out, as many of you will know, on the numerological significant date of 2/2/22, which was also Joyce's 40th birthday. Now, Joyce was also a kind of incurable, he had a kind of incurable passion with numbers, and he sort of insisted that the first volumes at least had to come out on 2nd February 2022. By the end of September, we have Eliot's Wasteland coming out in Criteria magazine. By the end of the year, Virginia Woolf has written Jacob's Room, and that has come out, in a sense, and she's also writing the drafts for Mrs. Dalloway. But that's not all. In fact, in the summer of 1922, Proust's Swan's Way, Côte de Chesson, is also published in English translation for the first time. Einstein's Theory of Relativity is published that year based on his 4 Princeton lectures. Wittgenstein's Tractatus is translated in English and published that year. So you see, you're looking at an arena of reading, which is, and I'd like to consider this as conversations between, or to look at it, it's possible to look at it as a network of texts responding to each other. Now, of course, they're not responding to each other in an overt way. In the case of Virginia Woolf, yes, because Virginia Woolf in the summer of 1922, usually the Woolfs would leave London and go to this place called Lewes, where they rented a cottage, or I think bought a cottage. And she had taken a reading along with her. And the 2 books that she was carrying with her one was Proust's Recherche, Swan's Way. The other was Joyce's Ulysses. And she was determined to read both. And we have extraordinary reader responses from Virginia Woolf as she's reading them, because she begins, in a sense, reading Ulysses with some pleasure. Especially she enjoys the 3rd and till about the cemetery chapter, Hades, Glasnevin Cemetery. But then she begins to become more and more critical of Ulysses, talks and writes. There is, in fact, barely concealed disgust in the way she's writing about Ulysses in her letters about Joyce. And it's well known about her, like supercilious schoolboy scratching his pimples. Yes, he has genius, but the taste of the genius is brackish. And she's particularly appalled by the character of Leopold Bloom, who she finds as completely insufferable, nauseating, and she hurls the word self-taught as almost a kind of abuse, a self-taught working man. So there is a kind of class as well as a kind of complete, really explicit disgust for the autodidactic nature of Leopold Bloom, which is one of the reasons I find him very interesting. You see, one of the reasons which you have these 2 characters, if you think of the chief characters, one is the university educated Stephen Dedalus, and then there is Leopold Bloom, who is completely self-taught. But he has a very interesting mind, and that I want to partially talk about that mind and what Joyce is trying to do with that mind in this book. So there is Stephen Dedalus for many of us, especially those of us who teach literature or who profess literature. that's much more relatable mind in a sense. You know, the same curriculum. He's read his Aristotle and he's read his Schiller and he's read his Bishop Berkeley, and he knows about all the cruxes and so on and forth in literary studies. Whereas Leopold Bloom's, if you like, his intellectual furniture is much more eccentric. It's kind of thrown together. His reading is, I mean, he knows about metempsychosis. He knows about world politics, world affairs. All of these swirl around in his head in a way which, but in a kind of completely ungoverned kind of way, and we only get access to them in fits and starts. In comparison, you know, if you look at Stephen's ruminations, there is a kind of a shape to it. He's talking, you know, there is an element of self-deprecation about it. There's also this desire for fame, for writing, the sort of tutorial he carries out, that scintillating tutorial on Shakespeare that he gives in the National Library of Scotland is an example of, you know, he's just playing around with ideas half seriously. You know, this whole thing about Shakespeare, bad puns, you know, sort of. But Leopold Bloom's, it is his mind which I find of great interest. And you know, what Joyce is trying to do, I suppose, among the many things he's trying to do is, in a sense, give us almost a history of Western thought and philosophy through the mind of Leopold Bloom. 2,000 years, 3,000 years, everything has been crammed into the head of one man. Now, what does a consciousness like that do? I mean, you know, you follow him all through the day. He's doing various things. He's reading papers. You see his consciousness, his subconscious, but then eventually it becomes a kind of a resume, if you like, kind of a history, which of course revels in excess. Everything is about in excess. It's a plenitude. And you also wonder about the mind of a person like this. And the reason why I find this mind fascinating is because it's self-taught. He didn't. Did Bloom go to university? No, he did not. What did he go to then? Where did he pick up his knowledge? And here there's a larger history, I think, of autodidacts in the late 19th and early 20th century. I think of that great work by the historian Jonathan Rose, where he talks about the intellectual life of the English working class, where he talks about mechanics libraries, he talks about adult education, he talks about classes for workers. Now, what libraries, blending libraries, subscription libraries, all of these for people who did not have an opportunity of a graduate degree, of going to college, or of going to a kind of finishing school. What kind of curriculum did they read? What kind of, and thanks to the records, library records, and so on, we know much more about this sort of 19th century working person and what they read, as let's say compared to somebody from the 16th or 17th centuries. We only have accident of history, such as, for example, that of the miller Menocchio, who was tortured by the Inquisition in the 17th century, and those Inquisition records were found, leading to that great book by the historian Carlo Ginzburg called The Cheese and the Worms. There, the Inquisition records of Menocchio tell us what he read, what a miller from Italy, maybe forget where he's from, which part of Italy he's from, what might he have read? How may he have then used that reading in his life? Now, again, that becomes, I suppose, one of the ways of making, reading Ulysses is trying to understand, and for me, this is interesting, the self-taught Leopold, the books that he reads, the books that he borrows, the books that he goes to return, the books that his wife, Molly Bloom, likes, for instance. We are slightly different from what he likes, racy novels by Paul de Kock and others. So it is interesting, therefore, to follow the mind of Bloom through the novel and try and see what is the flotsam and jetsam of Western civilization that occupies it. Of course, he also has a kind of a working person's knowledge about other cultures, but again, it's kind of refracted through various types of understanding and misunderstanding. Daedalus, in comparison, I find, if you look at that section called Proteus, I'll just read a little bit of it, where he's performing this thought experiment on the seashore, where he's shutting his eyes and he's walking along and he's thinking about various kinds of, so he says, it begins with those ineluctable modality of the visible. At least that, if no more, thought through my eyes. Signatures of all things I'm here to read. Sea spawn and sea rack, the nearing tide, that rusty boot, snot green, blue silver, rust, colored signs, limits of the diaphan. Ezra Pound uses the word diaphan very often when he's writing his cantos. But he adds, in bodies. Then he was aware of them bodies before of them colored. How? By knocking his cons against them? Sure, go easy. Bald, he was and a millionaire, maestro, the colored Chasano. So all this, Aristotelian references, the phrase from Dante's Inferno, the idea of diaphan, the idea of, this empiricism of George Berkeley, his discussion with Samuel Johnson. So all of them, he's sort of walking, as he walks, eyes closed, he listens to the, things cracking under him, his feet. My ash sword hangs at my side. Tap with it, they do. My 2 feet in his boots are at the ends of his legs. Nebenander sounds solid. So there's this 2 German phrases that he uses. He's sort of feeling his way. Am I walking into eternity along Sandymouth Strand? Crush, crack, crick, crick, wild sea money. So it's all very self-indulgent as well. He has time to kill. He's got some money from his school. He's out. There is a kind of little gap before he's going to meet other people. So he does this. And if you look at the way it reads, it's very opaque when you begin to read it. But again, I mean, if you sort of work your way through it, you can see that this is a fairly, I wouldn't say straightforward, but it's like solving a crossword puzzle. You get most of the stuff, some you don't get. And some are kind of wordplay that Joyce sometimes, fortunately or unfortunately, there's some horrible puns in Ulysses, I mean, which are so bad that you want to groan. I mean, come forth Lazarus and he came fifth, or something like that. Or when he talks about George Russell, who wrote under the pseudonym A.E. He said, oh, I borrowed some money from you. A.E., I owe you. That's a good pun, but it's also a bad pun. All good puns are bad puns, right? I mean, so here too, he's doing this kind of, the swirl of, on the one hand, somewhat self-regarding and self-important. Hello, Kinshire, put me onto Edenville, alpha, alpha, not on ones. Thinks about Adam, he thinks about Eve. There's sort of pun on Heva, naked Eve, etc. And then, of course, his favorite topic, consubstantiality of the Father and the Son. He's constantly talking about the Arian heresy, Arius, and his theories of, his heresy from the Orthodox Christian thought. So he has some unlikely and obscure heroes who he's constantly talking about. So, and there are some marvelous passages, for instance, which are really a joy to perform. For instance, this one, which is one of my favorite, just sort of googling it. No, I don't think I can find it right now. So he thinks about his works becoming, yes. So this little bit I'll just read. And Cousin Stephen, you will never be a saint. Isle of Saints, you were awfully holy, weren't you? Remember in Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, there Stephen Didals goes through a very religious phase, and then he sort of becomes completely what gets out of it. You prayed to the Blessed Virgin that you might not have a red rose. You prayed to the devil in Serpentine Avenue that the fubsy widow in front might lift her clothes still more from the wet street. Oh, si certo, sell your soul for that. So he's sort of going through very quickly through the kind of characters you had in Dubliners. So just give me 10 seconds. There's a dog scratching at my door. I need to go and get the dog because I warned you, this is occupational hazard. 1 second. Yeah, sorry, I'm back. So, and then he imagines, you see, this is, he wanted to be a writer and he thought he would be a great writer, and he sort of looks back on his fantasy of being a writer, reading 2 pages a piece of 7 books every night, eh? I was young. You bowed to yourself in the mirror, stepping forward to applause earnestly, striking face. No, he sort of said that was what you were. And now look at you. You've come back from Paris, you have not fulfilled your dreams. You hooray for the goddamned idiot. Hooray, no one saw, tell no one. Books you were going to write. with letters for titles. Have you read his F? Oh, yes, but I prefer Q. W is wonderful. Oh, yes, we read W. Remember your epiphanies on green oral leaves, deeply deep, copies to be sent if you died to all the great libraries of the world, including Alexandria. Someone was to read them after a few thousand years, the Mahamanantara. Pico della Mirandola like I, very like a whale. When one reads these strange pages of one long gone, one feels that one is at one with one who once. You can see this is fun. This is actually great fun. And somebody he's still, while he's poking fun at himself, he can laugh at himself. But Stephen is like that, at least at the beginning. I mean, he's sort of, he's somewhat bitter about the way things have turned out. Remember, to the end of Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, there's this word epiphany. He has this epiphany, and then he thinks of going to Paris. He thinks of this three-master ship with the hands spread out. They call out to him, and this promise of the whole world lying in front of him. And it's this sort of ecstatic, euphoric ending to the novel. And I go, oh life, I go forth to forge in the smithy of my soul, the conscience of my race, something like that. Now, when he comes back from Paris, it's completely different person. I mean, his mother's dead. He suffers from guilt because she has not been able to, even on deathbed, he couldn't sort of bring himself to join in a faith. He is what happened in Paris, we hardly know. There's a fits and snatches of what has happened, sunlight on a Parisian pavement, but none of that he didn't really have the adventures that he was hoping to have. And he does not speak about Paris or the continent in any, he talks about, exiles or emigres in Paris. There's certain things I know, but it's all told in a tone of, I wouldn't say intense, but there is an element of self-loathing in that things didn't really work out the way he did. But then Dublin gradually reveals himself to him as the day progresses and the evening progresses and so on and forth. So you see, I mean, and somewhere along the way, he will meet Leopold Bloom, who's also going about his own way. And again, there is a kind of a Baudelairean element here. I would think, I mean, in a big city, Dublin isn't as big as Paris. I mean, and everyone seems to know each other. That's the other thing in Dublin. I mean, whenever they meet in pubs or in cemeteries or in newspaper office, there is a sense that we know there's this set of people in Dublin and we know about them. I mean, I wonder if a poem such as Are You une Passante or To a Passerby, which is one of Baudelaire's most famous poems, which he writes about the erotic charge which is created when he meets a woman on the streets of Paris, very handsome, dressed in black. And she said that I'm not going to meet, the whole point is that this is a chance meeting and it will never happen again. I'm not going to see her again. This is something which Walter Benjamin calls not love at first sight, but love at last sight. That one of the attractions of the city is that you will not meet this person anymore. And it is that moment which is therefore precious, full of possibilities, which of course are not realized because you will not meet that person again. Now, Dublin is somehow not like that, because in Dublin there is a theme of a return. See, there has to be a return. Because it's, of course, it's Ulysses' story, it's Odysseus, it's Odyssey. Odyssey is returning. He's returning home. In the Homeric epic, it is the theme of nostos, return. You know that there are three sections to the epic, the Telemachy and the nostos, which is about Ulysses' wanderings. Now, Ulysses, that is to say, the Homeric hero, he's a hero, isn't he? He's fought in a battle, he's won the battle. Now the man can't go back home. He's sort of wandering around in a fairly small body of water, not being able to go home. And finally gets home to Ithaca, after many adventures and misadventures, losing a lot of people, falling into all kinds of scrapes. Leopold Bloom walks about in a city, in modern-day Dublin. Everyday things happen to him. Nothing remarkable happens to him. No one. It's not as if he commits a bank robbery or someone comes and mugs him. It turns remarkable in certain ways. It's nothing like that happens. It's mundane. It's everyday things. Nothing remarkable happens in that sense, which could be part of a crime novel or kind of even a love story. He goes to the seaside, watches a woman from afar, masturbates. It's all at a very kind of a long distance and nothing. So why is this interesting? How can, or is it in fact heroic? Is there, what kind of heroisms are we looking at? I mean, these are questions which we begin to ask ourselves. Can the everyday be heroic? We think of, remarkable acts as acts of heroism. You go and rescue someone, or you write, you perform, or you write, or do something brilliant. People praise you, or you commit a crime. It does not have to be something good. It can be something evil. But that becomes that, well, we want to read about that. We want to know about that because it's out of the ordinary. But can the everyday become heroic? Can the everyday become, in fact, not only just heroic, and heroic in the Homeric sense, the hero has to return home finally. You have to get back home. Now, of course, after you've drunk all your beers and whiskeys, you have to go back home at one point of time. And they do, eventually they do. And then they go back to 7 Necklace Street. And finally, Leopold Bloom will go back to his bed after that extraordinary section called Ithaca, which is based entirely of questions and answers. Many years ago, when I was a graduate student doing a PhD on something entirely, some very boring stuff, we did a little theatrical kind of an event in the college where I was at in England. And one of the events, it was kind of an installation all across the college. And one of the events was called Ithaca, where two actors, one personating Leopold Bloom and one Stephen Dedalus, walked around the college enacting the Ithaca section, asking each other questions and answers. Now, of course, that's not exactly how it happens in the Ithaca section. By the time we come to Ithaca, Bloom and Ulysses, Bloom has invited Stephen Dedalus, whom he has just met, to their house, makes him a cup of cocoa or tea, I forget which, but by the time, and there are questions and answers which are asked. I mean, what did he have on his mantelpiece? What books were there? It's a kind of encyclopedic catechism of all kinds of possible questions. This extraordinary section on water, and the entire water. I mean, it's like a history, sort of a description of the water supply in Dublin. In all its, with all the scientific terminology and all the kind of geographical and whatever water management terms that you might think of. But in that theatrical performance, which again, as I said, was taking place all over the college. So these two actors were walking up the stairs while we were following them. We found a remarkable way of understanding Ithaca, as a question and answers between two characters who were walking side by side, as it were, who were walking while we were following them, to people idly walking home. Now, again, in these ways of consuming the city, and of course, the city has, in earlier chapters, we have seen other kinds of, other kinds of groupings of Dubliners, we might say, a funeral cortege, newspaper editors and their stringers in one place, a group of I suppose men of letters is the word I'm looking for. I mean, in the National Library of Scotland and so on and so forth. And eventually it's down to these two people who are going back to 7 Necklace Street, where Molly Bloom is waiting in bed. Now, about Penelope and Molly Bloom, one could say a great deal, but of course, we don't really have the time. Now, again, as I said, in our class, when we read this, we are, these are some of the trajectories we are trying to follow. Of course, this is only scratching the surface of the way in which, but Ulysses is constructed. I mean, you can talk about the structure, the schematics, the schema, Gilbert Murray, which we sort of put it down in a rather mechanical way. But at the end of the day, Joyce is able to, I think, persuade us that this is something which is part of the world of the novel. He brings something into the world of the novel, which perhaps, I'm not saying that it did not exist before. Again, as I said, there are 19th century forebears to the Joycean way of looking at everyday life. I mean, Woolf certainly experimented with that at the same time. And I think he was also alarmed because Joyce was approaching this question from an entirely different way. You see, if you read Woolf's Jacob's Room, which also comes out in 1922, it is a novel about emptiness. Jacob, the titular character, you hardly know anything about that person. You think of Ulysses, you think you are in a sense given access to every nook and cranny of the minds of Leopold Bloom and Stephen Dedalus. We know everything about them. Stuff you want to know, you don't want to know. Same year, a novel like Jacob's Room, Jacob disappears into the First World War, doesn't come back. His room is empty. His room, Jacob's room, is empty. His mother, towards the end of the novel, picks up a pair of boots and says, what did you think he was coming back? She says, wait, let me first find that little bit. He says, what am I to do with this, Mr. Bonamy? He left everything just as it was in his room. Nothing arranged, all his letters strewn about for anyone to read. What did he expect? Did he think he would come back? And, when he holds up these boots in a last paragraph, what am I to do with these? It's a huge emptiness. We know nothing about Jacob, nothing about his life that we know about. He's just disappeared, leaving a blank, leaving an unkept room. Now, Woolf was approaching this from an entirely different point of view. When she looked at Joyce, when she read Joyce, she said things like, and I've just got this quote out, this very famous quote. She said that he's myriads of bullets, tiny bullets. She says that Ulysses is, but Leonard Woolf thought, of course, and Eliot, who was visiting the Woolfs in the summer of 1922, Eliot was absolutely, ecstatic about it. He said that, it is one of the great novels. It is completely, the 19th century basis of novel has been completely demolished by Ulysses. But here is Virginia Woolf, amused, stimulated, charmed, interested by the first 2 or 3 chapters to the end of the cemetery scene, then puzzled, bored, irritated, disillusioned as if by queasy undergraduate scratching his pimples. And finally, an illiterate, underbred book, it seems to me, the book of a self-taught working man. And we all know how distressing they are, how egotistic, insistent, raw, striking, and ultimately nauseating. Now, again, Eliot is, and Eliot turns up in that household in the beginning of September. He's just sent off Wasteland to the press, and he says that. Then they continue to discuss this, that Woolf grudgingly says that, yes, it's genius, it has a thing, but of the inferior water, brackish. And Woolf is also making these notes in her diary about while she's planning Jacob's room. She says, I think the main point she's writing, this is Woolf writing, I think the main point is that it should be free. Yet, what about form? Let us suppose that the room will hold it together. This room is the name of the novel. Intensity of life compared with immobility. Experiences to change style at will. In a sense, both novels are trying to achieve the same thing, a kind of a intensity of form, style, and feeling. But they're approaching them to different directions. And for Joyce, as I said, Joyce's novel is all about plenitude, all about excess, and so on and forth. But not so for Virginia Woolf. Now, the last few things I have to say, again, as I said, we have only 10 minutes or so left. One thing I would alert everyone to, and this is a kind of not something that you hear in a literature class, and that in the literature class, one looks at the text and the author. What is configured in literary studies is the figure of the author. Then the text. The text is seen through a kind of a authorial lens. But we also know that a novel is not just the work of one person. There is this, what I've called elsewhere, invisible ecology of labor. A lot of other people, a lot of people come together to make a book possible, but you don't see their roles. Now, as a publisher myself, I find this untold or invisible ecology fascinating. Think of Joyce. He comes to Paris, no one will publish him. Even for Dubliners, there were 7 or 8 refusals before the book was finally published. The novel Ulysses began to be serialized in the Little Review. Then after 8 or 9 installments, it got into trouble because of obscenity. Little Review was an American journal. There was a law called Comstock law in America where you could be prosecuted for sending obscenity through the obscene literature through the post. So all copies of Little Review were seized. They were burnt. Joyce could not finish his novel, publishing his novel serially. He was in Paris. And then a woman, and all these, everyone who sustained Joyce were women. The women editor of Little Review, then a young American called Sylvia Beach, who had opened a bookshop in Paris in 1921. All of these accidental. Had she not gone to this party thrown by a French poet called André Spier, she would not have met Adrienne Monnier, a Parisian bookseller, a woman bookseller, who ran a bookshop called Le Livre, the bookshop of this Ami le Livre, the place of the lovers of books or friends of books. They became lovers, Adrienne and Sylvia Beach. Sylvia Beach opened a bookshop called Shakespeare and Company. And then it was Sylvia Beach who published Ulysses. It was a nightmare publishing Ulysses, especially for a printer. The printer was a man called Darentière, who had a printing press in Dijon, famous for his mustard. Joyce made corrections even till the last weekend. So I told you, 2nd February 1922 was when the first copies of the book came out from the press. That was, I think, a Monday. Joyce was sending corrections till Friday. But he was also adamant he wanted the first copies on his 40th birthday. So Darentière had to take a train from Dijon to Paris at the Gare du Lion, one of the three train stations in Paris. Sylvia Beach was anxiously waiting. He had sent the first 2 copies with the guard of the train, the Dijon-Paris Express. He got down from the station on the platform. He gave the copies to Sylvia Beach. Sylvia Beach took a taxi, went over to James Joyce's house, rang the bell. James Joyce, this eccentric Irishman, opened the door, took the 2 books, Ulysses. And he also did a lot of other things which were, extraordinary in its, it's when we read a modern day edition of Ulysses, we just read it for the text, right? We are not looking for any other signs. But Ulysses, and one could spend a whole class talking about this. If you look at the manuscript of Ulysses, and this is, you will find corrections such as there is one page where there is a little telegram of a man who dies at the age of 88. Now, Joyce inserted that later. It was not part of the original manuscript. He inserted it later on page 88, on line 8, so that it would be an 8-word telegram saying that somebody had died aged 88. So he was, in fact, using page numbers, page lines to make additional points. For example, in one place where Bloom thinks about the speed of falling bodies, we know from physics, it's 32 feet per second. It was heavily revised to make it fall on the 32nd line. Then in one place, Bloom thinks about cycles. That's, on page 360, Bloom thinks about cycles, the whole 360 degrees. In the Odyssey Press edition, published from Hamburg in 1932, Ulysses was published in 2 volumes. On page 366 of volume 1, dusk is falling on Dublin. Why 366? 1904, the actual year in which, 16th June, on which Ulysses is supposed to take place, so leap year, 366 days. He designed, the Odyssey Press edition was designed to mimic the diurnal structure of the day. In page 366 ends the Nausicaa chapter when dusk is falling upon Dublin and Bloom's consciousness is being gradually extinguished. He looks at the semicircular Dublin Bay, one half of the day, things done half by design. And on page 367 of the next volume 1, the next part of the second diurnal section of the day begins. So you see, all of this has, Joyce was actually playing around the expressive features of the book in order to make points about. So, of course, this is, as I said, nightmarish for printers and publishers. I mean, you want somebody, suddenly he adds a line here and insists that it should fall on the 32nd line, or it should be 8 words and so on and so forth. And he was constantly doing these things. Now, it is, again, most of the editions now don't sort of replicate these idiosyncrasies. But therefore, Joyce was packing into this book all kinds of little, Easter eggs, as it were, for people to discover later. And there's, of course, the whole industry about this, and competing readings of Joyce. There are, many of you will know about the very famous Gabler edition of James Joyce, the so-called synoptic edition of Joyce, because, it became almost impossible to establish a kind of authentic Ulysses, because there were so many problems with the manuscripts, so many additions, alterations. And then, of course, there was this extraordinary figure, and I'll stop with that. If you Google, you will find that there was a man called Dr. Kidd, who was this opponent of Gabler, who wanted to, refute him at every point. I said, no, you've got this wrong, you've got this wrong. And he used to work somewhere, I think, in Stanford University or New York, I forget. And then he disappears. He just goes and disappears. He's talking to pigeons and so on, and disappears. And there's this sort of the mystery of the disappeared Joycean scholar. I won't tell you what happens at the end. There is you can look at. So he did all these he looked at all this numerology which Joyce was doing and he sort of wrote letters, and it was all this preparing this alternative edition, which never happened. But I'll not tell you what happens eventually to this mysterious Joycean scholar who disappears after talking to pigeons. Anyway, on that note, I'll stop, I think. This is just a kind of a very rambling talk on some of the things I found of interest in this novel, and which will, I suppose, a kind of a endless search for all these little, trying to solve these little puzzles, as it were. So if you have, as I said, any questions, don't feel shy, and let's just ask, or anything at all which you wish to raise or talk about. If we have a few minutes. Thank you for your patience on a Friday evening.
Yeah, anyone with questions, they can switch on their mic and video and ask, or write in the chat box. In the meantime, I have a question. It's kind of a two-part question, and it's also from the publisher's point of view, perhaps. What still amazes me after all these years is how did the publishers really agree to publish this? Because for a long time nothing really happens, and what do from the publisher's point of view, what do the readers really get out of this? Are they doing it for the future? Are they doing it having this complete faith on the literary style of Joyce? That's my first question. My second question is, as they say that everything that has been written can be filmed, but how does one film Ulysses? If you show him walking, can Ulysses be filmed or perceived without the absence of language, so to say? Is visual enough, is my question. Can visual ever be enough for Ulysses?
I think it's a fascinating question, and has Ulysses been filmed? I don't know.
No, never.
It's no, apparently there was. There is. I've just been googling. So apparently there was an attempt in 1967, but who knows whether it's completely disappeared. And for 20, you have to do not 24 hours, but pretty much almost all of the day. Now, you can't really, unless you are a filmmaker like Belatar or Love Diaz, who probably they should be, they should be the ones who bring Ulysses, watch it for 7-8 hours, no bathroom breaks, something like that. Otherwise, I don't see how it can be made, right? You cannot compress that into or you could make a web series, maybe. Maybe what you are looking at, in fact, is the modern the web series or the OTT platform. This perhaps would be ideal for Ulysses, but of course, you need a certain kind of storytelling. And as you very rightly pointed out, it is because the language is such an important function. It's not just visual. It just can't be a day in Dublin. You see, what you're looking at, in a cinema, that the senses, that is, it's sight and sound. These are the two senses which are supreme. And in a sense, you're also a passive consumer of sight and sound. You're looking at. You don't smell things, for instance, in a film, which is again something which you have to immediately leave out. But again, much of what is going on in Ulysses is cognition, is thought, is unstructured thought. Now, maybe you could make an animated film out of it. since this film question is actually a very interesting one, you perhaps cannot shoot it in convention way, but you could perhaps animate it. You could perhaps make that you need other media. I'm not saying that it cannot be visualized. What Stephen is doing in the Proteus chapter is actually a very interesting experiment there, that his eyes are closed, but he's still sort of using other senses to supplement the lack of seeing. And then, of course, also posing it as a philosophical question. Now, again, if you're not seeing, if your eyes are closed, then what can cinema do for you? Can cinema do anything for you? Can cinema actually show you something in between actual sight and what you see in the back of your eyelids? Because you're seeing something. I mean, when we close our eyes, we see something. You see, but in a very different way. And that's thought, that sight translates into certain patterns that stimulate certain signals from our brain, and they fall into a certain kind of thought. Now, again, I mean, this seems to be a huge challenge. It would be a great challenge for any filmmaker to do that, but it also would be, I think, something which perhaps other modes of filmmaking than the conventional mode could take on. But again, I don't know if anyone's done animated Ulysses or animated part of Ulysses, not that I know of. As far as the question of publishers is concerned, it seems to me that there is a difference in the mode of publishing, in the economy of publishing. Let us say, if you think of the 19th century Victorian novel or the 19th century novel in Europe, they wouldn't have touched Ulysses because it had a very specific kind of arithmetic of profit and loss. Not huge profits, not huge losses, but a kind of safe and conservative arithmetic. But as that Victorian novel, which is by definition large, it begins to diminish, both literally and metaphorically, in the 1890s. And as the short form opens up, we think of like nowadays in journalism, we often hear the term short form and long form. If I may use that for fiction, if we think of the novel, conventional novel as long form, we also think of the short story, or indeed the short novel as short form. And a kind of ecology of publishing opens up for these, which is to a large extent supported by magazines and what we might call small magazines. Dial, Review, Poetry, this, that. I mean, there is this plethora of magazines in the early 20th century, and which interestingly are almost entirely run by women. It's the first time it seemed that the women were, of course, in the English novel, they were the predominant producers of the novel in the 19th century. In the early 20th century, in modernism, they become publishers and editors. They create and booksellers, which is, I think, unprecedented in the history of literature. You could say the entire West, I mean, even taking Pound into account, Western modernism literary modernism would not have been possible without women editors, women publishers, and women booksellers. Now, they were working in a very different kind of way. The ecology of a periodical is very different from that of the book. And I think to a very large extent, the values of the periodical. So again, Ulysses was being serialized first. Of course, you may argue that 19th century novels were also serialized. Dickens was serialized, Eliot was serialized, but there was a different kind of approach to that serial publication. That too was very commercial. So there was a kind of, again, a very clear calculus of profit and loss, of payments, of royalties, and so on and forth. Now, but it is also true that most 1920s publishers did not want to touch Joyce. The number of refusals that he had, and eventually it was an expatriate American publisher in Paris who publishes Joyce, is, I think, an accident in a way. It could also well not have been published. Of course, Joyce was well known by then. He had a reputation for brilliance. Portrait had been published. Dubliners had been published and had done fairly well. Grant Richards, after 7 refusals, had taken on. So there was also, people were in awe of him, that, this brilliant Irishman who lives. At the same time, as a business proposition, if you wanted to publish Ulysses and make money out of it, you wouldn't do it. So in a sense, yes, if posterity, for fame, for whatever, but it's a very canny move, and they did it, and and it became what it was. So, but the thing is, and again, as I said, these are histories we never know about. I mean, we know about the great classic. We do not know about how many refusals they go. I mean, this is not part of our literature curriculum. You know, this book was refused 15 times by 15 publishers before somebody. So it may not have been published. We wouldn't have known about it. Or let us say, as I've been arguing, Hope Merlis's Paris masterpiece, 150 copies. It's 150 copies is when you publish it and it's gone. I mean, no, it's like not publishing. So if somebody publishes it, you just print actually maybe 175 copies. That's like you give to your friends and families, and that's 1/3 gone. I mean, you know, so that's not publishing in that sense. So even if you get published, you might disappear. And if you're lucky, somebody discovers you one day later.
Right. And also, do you think that he also takes the, you know, what fascinates me also is do you think Joyce and also Woolf, by and large, do take the idea of walking very much from Baudelaire? And, you know, you find, you know, can you talk about the relevance of walking in Ulysses?
Walking is, you know, you see, cities become, I mean, you couldn't walk around earlier, I suppose, in the early 19th, late 18th century with any degree of safety in a modern city. You know, with modern cities, and again, Benjamin writes about it, you need light, you need, you know, some degree of safety. There is a moment in history when, and I think mid-19th century, there are many urban improvements, Paris particularly, you know, the house manification of Paris takes place where the entire center of Paris is restructured to make it a much more rectilinear and irregular city with long prospects. And there's a lot of writing on that. But that, Benjamin writes about the street lights. Paris becomes a noctambulist city, he says. People are out walking at night or along the arcades. Now, again, history of illumination and cities is very closely linked. I mean, you know, you can't walk around in the dark. And these are all cities in the temperate zones. So you can't really, if you walk around only in daytime, you will only be walking like till 3 in the afternoon, then it's dark. So if the city has to be, you know, has to become open for business and pleasure and vices and everything, the city has to be lit. Other amenities have to be provided. You have to have restrooms and toilets, and, you know, people can drink water. Now, all these improvements are happening in modern cities in the mid-19th century. Paris, and notably, there's an underground. You can travel. You need to come back home. You know, you're out on the night. You're out for a night on the, and then you need to come back home. So there are many things that lead to this moment where walking can become possible. Now, there are other people walk as well. I mean, but that's sort of out of necessity, because a milkman or whatever, just to give an example, or a coachman, they will walk or they will go to places, but that because they have to. You know, thinking of leisure and thinking of a you know, that kind of leisurely walking becomes possible in the late 19th. Also, it's a period of, you know, historically in Europe, it's a period of relative peace. There are no great wars. There will be no war till the Great War, 1914. So, you know, you begin to walk, and that becomes a part of everyday habit. If you're a person in the city, you walk around the city. The city becomes available to you for walking. There's all these paintings. If you constantly see the modernist paintings, impressionists and post-impressionists, they're all about people walking around, people at leisure. So you won't see that, for example, in art of the previous period. You won't see people, pedestrians, in the 17th or even 18th century painting. You won't even see the city there. You see the countryside, etc. But then in the history of art too, the city becomes, you write, then of course there's the rise of photography, right? You know, capture of the moving subject, all of these sort of, I think they sort of converge in the time that we are talking of in Baudelaire's Paris, or slightly later.
Right. Does anyone have any questions? Otherwise, we'll wrap up the session. Okay. So we'll wrap up the session. So thank you so much, Professor Gupta, Chidda, for your profound insights and delightful history surrounding the text. And I hope we'll have more sessions with you again in the near future. And thank you so much. Thanks to everyone for being patient and cooperative.
Yes, there are a couple of comments which I'll just respond to very quickly. Yes, it was I mean, one of you has complained that it's a slightly high level for a beginner. I'm sorry about that, but it's all right. Question you don't necessarily need to have knowledge of, but if you read a bit of Ulysses, you'll see that questions don't have to be asked immediately. It's not mandatory, but do try and read a bit of Ulysses if you can at a certain point of time, and you'll see that it's not as daunting or as difficult as you might have thought it was. Okay, then it's a pleasure, and yes, as I said again, thank you for taking time out on Friday evening. I'm sure you might have had better things to do, and thank you for for listening, and thank you, Abhijit, for inviting me.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Sure, we'll have more opportunities to meet in the future.
Absolutely.
Bye. Then have a great weekend, everyone.
Same to you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.